The lantern had burned down to its last inch of tallow when Veyn realized she was going to have to use her hands. Not her tools, not the iron press or the engraving stylus or the wax-setting kit she kept rolled in oilcloth at the bottom of her pack. Her hands, the ones she had spent 12 years training to be steady, to be precise, to hold a graving needle with the same pressure a surgeon holds a blade. The ones that were now shaking so badly she could barely get her fingers around the latch of her kit. The war commander of the Iron-Hold Pact lay dying on the floor of a collapsed map room, and the field surgeon who should have been there had taken an arrow through the throat 40 minutes ago, and Veyn was a cartographer. That was her title, her designation. The only thing the Stonemark Guild had ever permitted her to be, a woman who made maps, who charted borders, who crawled on her belly across disputed terrain in the dark to measure distances that generals would later argue over with clean hands and warm wine. She was not a healer. She did not belong in this room with a man whose chest had been torn open by shrapnel from a collapsed siege mechanism. But there was no one else, and he was still breathing, and she had her tools. The largest graving needle in her kit was 3 inches long, curved at the tip for fine detail work, and strong enough to pierce leather without bending. She had a spool of waxed linen thread, the kind she used to bind map rolls. She had a flask of distilled spirits she kept for cleaning her instruments. She had learned field surgery the way she had learned everything. By watching, by being invisible enough that people forgot she was there, by listening at the edge of conversations she was not supposed to hear. The garrison physician at Stonemark's eastern outpost had stitched a man's arm back together in front of her once, and she had memorized every movement, because that was what she did. She catalogued things. She measured them. She kept them. She poured the spirits over her hands, over the needle, and she knelt beside Tarquin Ashvale, war commander of the Iron-Hold Pact, and she began. He was unconscious. That was a mercy. The shrapnel had opened his side from the lower rib down to the hip. Not as deep as it looked, she told herself. Not as bad, even though the blood had already soaked through the canvas beneath him and was creeping toward her knees in a slow, dark tide. She worked methodically, the way she worked on a difficult coastline, 1 point at a time, one measurement, then the next. Don't look at the hole. Look at the part in front of you. The waxed thread was too stiff. She realized it on the 4th stitch, when the knot pulled loose, because the thread had no give, no elasticity, nothing to move with the body. It would hold for an hour, maybe 2, and then it would tear free and he would bleed out in his sleep. She sat back on her heels and looked at her hands. She had a braid. She had worn it since she was 16, a single plait down her back, brown shot through with dark red in certain light, kept bound with a strip of rawhide. She had not cut it in 9 years, not since her mother had braided it the last time, before Veyn left Stonemark for the guild, and she had promised herself she would keep it because her mother's hands had been patient and careful in a way that nothing else in the world ever was. She reached behind her head and pulled the braid forward over her shoulder. She had been told her hair was unusual. Too fine to hold a curl, the older women said, but too strong to break. She had tested it herself, more than once, the way she tested everything, methodically, with her hands. You could not snap a single strand. You could pull until your fingers ached and it would not give. The guild women had laughed about it. The only strong thing about her, they said it like it was a joke. She unbound the braid. She began to separate it into single threads. The first stitch went in at the uppermost edge of the wound, and the war commander of the Iron-Hold Pact made a sound she had never heard a person make. Something low and old, a sound from below language, like a foundation stone shifting. His eyes opened. She had seen his eyes before across council tables, through the glass of garrison windows, in the margins of briefings where his likeness had been sketched for field identification. Grey. She had thought they were grey. In the descriptions she had read, in the reports she had filed, she had always written grey. They were not grey. They were a color she did not have a name for, a deep silver that held light the way still water holds the sky, and they found her face with an immediacy that stopped her hands. She kept stitching. If she stopped, he would die. "What are you doing?" he said. Not a question. The voice of a man who had given orders long enough that even half-conscious, it came out as a statement. "Closing your wound," she said. "Don't move." "With what?" "Thread." A pause. She felt his attention move to her hands, to the single strand of hair she was guiding through the graving needle's eye. "Your hair," he said. "It's the strongest material I have. The waxed linen won't hold." He was quiet for 3 stitches. She counted them. She counted everything. It was the only way she knew how to stay calm, to stay here in this room, with this much blood and this much consequence. Then he said, "What's your name?" "Veyn. Cartographic Division. Stonemark Guild. Don't move, Veyn." He said it the way you say a word when you're trying to locate it on a map. Finding it. Placing it. How many stitches? 11 so far. I need 20 more at least. Possibly 30. He said nothing after that. He lay still with his jaw set and his strange silver eyes fixed on the collapsed ceiling above them, and she worked. She lost count of what she was feeling somewhere around the 15th stitch. There was the precision, the familiar trance of fine work, and underneath it something she could not catalogue, a warmth that came through the needle, through the thread, through her fingertips, settling somewhere between her ribs with a pressure that was not pain and was not nothing. Like a room she hadn't known existed opening a door. When she tied the last knot, her hands were steady. She didn't know when that had happened. He spoke before she could stand. "Come back." She was already rising. "The wound is closed, you need." I said, "Come back." The voice was different now, something underneath the command. She turned and looked at him, and his eyes were fixed on her face with a focus that made her feel surveyed, measured, mapped. She understood that feeling. She spent her life doing it to landscapes. She knelt again. He reached out, slowly, with visible effort, and took her hand, the one that held the graving needle. His fingers closed around her wrist, careful, like he was handling something breakable, and when his skin touched hers, the warmth she had felt through the needle became something else entirely. It moved through her the way pressure moves through water, spreading outward, finding every edge. "The thread," he said. "It's not closing the wound. It is. I can see. It's doing something else." His eyes were very clear. "I can feel it, like stitches through something underneath the skin." She looked down at his chest. In the poor light of the dying lantern, she almost convinced herself she was imagining it. Almost. But there was a faint luminescence along the line of each stitch, not bright enough to be called a glow. More like the quality of light on a river at dusk, and it was pulsing, very slightly. In time with his heartbeat. She pulled her hand back. He let her, but his eyes followed. "I'm a cartographer," she said. "I don't know what that is." "Neither do I," he said. "But I think you should stay." She stayed. The 3 days that followed were a study in controlled chaos. Tarquin Ashvale should not have survived. That was the honest assessment of Corval, the senior field surgeon who arrived with the relief column on the second morning, examined the stitched wound, and stood very still for a long time before asking who had closed it. "The cartographer," said one of the guards. Corval looked at Veyn. He looked at the stitches. He reached out with 2 fingers, the way you test the tension of a bowstring, and pressed gently beside the nearest one. He pulled his hand back. "These stitches," he said carefully, "are not just holding tissue." "I know," Veyn said. "I don't know what else they're doing." "Neither do I," said Corval, and he had the look of a man who found that deeply alarming. "I've been practicing field medicine for 18 years. I have never seen wound edges knit like this. The tissue is absorbing the thread. Your thread. As if the body is choosing to incorporate it rather than reject it." He met her eyes. "What are you?" "A cartographer," she said, for the second time in 3 days. He did not look satisfied. But he didn't have time to push it further, because Tarquin chose that moment to wake up and immediately try to sit upright, which led to a heated argument between the war commander of the Ironhold Pact and his senior surgeon that Veyn withdrew from entirely stepping back into the corner of the room the way she had always stepped back, becoming part of the furniture, invisible, except Tarquin's eyes found her across the room, immediately, like a compass settling north. "Don't go far," he said, still talking to Corval, but the words were for her. She didn't go far. She told herself it was practical. The relief column had its own work to do, and she was effectively stranded until someone could spare an escort back to the guild's nearest outpost. She told herself it was professional. She had a commission to complete, border measurements that were already 3 days overdue, and she could work just as well here as anywhere. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that the warmth she had felt through the thread had not entirely faded, that it lived now somewhere behind her sternum, in a place she could not locate precisely on any map she had ever drawn, and that when she moved more than 2 rooms away from the man she had stitched, it pulled, faintly, the way a compass needle pulls toward north when you hold it near a lodestone. On the 4th day he found her working. She was in the corner of the salvaged war room, spread across a camp table with her instruments and the half-finished survey she had been carrying when the siege mechanism collapsed. The light was better here than in the medical tent, and she had commandeered 2 candle stubs from the supply stores, and she was measuring the distance between 2 elevation points with the same focused attention she brought to everything. She didn't hear him coming. For a man who had been sewn back together 4 days ago, he moved with an unsettling quiet. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell across her work. "Cartography," he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She felt him looking at the maps. "Show me," he said. She looked up. He was dressed, properly for the first time, in dark wool and worn leather, his color much improved, his eyes alert. The stitches were hidden beneath his shirt, but she could feel, somehow, the faint hum of them. She was choosing not to examine that. "Show you what?" she said. "What you're working on. How you do it." She looked back at the map. "It's just measurement. Nothing interesting. Show me anyway." So she showed him. She explained the elevation notation system she had developed herself, the shorthand for terrain type, the way she built a landscape in 2 dimensions out of 100 separate measurements. She talked about sight lines and dead angles and the particular problem of mapping coastline, which never held still, which changed with every tide and storm. She talked about the difference between a survey map and a navigation map, between what the land was and what a person moving through it needed to know. Somewhere in the middle of explaining how she marked uncertain terrain, a small open circle, a question she carried with her until she could return to close it. She became aware that he was not looking at the maps, he was looking at her. "What?" she said. "You go somewhere else when you talk about this." He said it simply, as observation. "Your face changes." She had no response to that. She looked back at the maps. Veyn, the way he said her name had shifted from the first time. He was not placing it anymore. He knew exactly where it was. "When I return to Ironhold, you won't be filing maps for the guild." She stiffened. "If this is about the stitches, whatever happened with the thread, I didn't intend it. I don't know how to undo it, and I don't know what it means, and I'm sorry if it's caused. You'll have a workshop," he said. "Your own survey library, every instrument the guild has and those it doesn't. You'll map what you want to map, not what someone else needs charted." She stared at him. "I make survey maps," she said. "For a living, for the guild. I have a contract. I have obligations. I'll deal with the guild. You can't just. I'm the war commander of the Ironhold Pact," he said, and there was a quiet that surrounded the words that was not arrogance but simply fact. "I can deal with the guild." She looked at the map on the table between them, at the small open circles she scattered through uncertain terrain, all the questions she carried and returned to. "I don't understand," she said, "why you would do that." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, very deliberately, the way you place a stone marker on a border point. And through the contact, through that same warmth she had felt through the thread, she heard it. Not with her ears, with something else, the particular frequency of a thing that had already decided. "Because you used yourself to keep me alive," he said, without hesitation, without asking what it would cost you. "That doesn't leave me." He paused. "And neither, I think, does the thread." She pulled her hand back, stood up, walked to the tent entrance and looked out at the grey afternoon and breathed. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said, "I need to think." And she went back to her maps. The journey to Ironhold took 8 days on horseback. Veyn had informed Tarquin on the 5th day that she was coming, not because she had decided, but because the alternative was 3 months of guild contract work in a disputed coastal region where 3 cartographers had already gone missing, and she had run out of reasons to pretend that was a better option. She did not tell him about the pulling feeling. The way distance between them made something in her chest strain, the way a taut thread strains before it snaps. She told herself it was the stitches, some physical consequence of whatever had happened with the thread, a kind of sympathetic tension that would fade when the wounds finished healing. She told herself that for approximately 2 more days, and then she stopped because she was a cartographer, and she had built her entire career on being honest about what she actually observed, rather than what she preferred to be true. Ironhold was a city carved from the mountain it sat on. Veyn had mapped its outer walls twice, from the valley floor, but she had never been inside. The interior rose in terraced levels, connected by stone-cut passages and external stairways, the whole thing oriented to catch the morning sun on the upper levels, while the lower city stayed warm from the mountain's own heat. It was extraordinary. She was quietly furious about how extraordinary it was, because she had not budgeted for caring about Ironhold, and now she would have to. The workshop Tarquin had described was real. She found it on the 2nd morning, shown there by a young aide who knocked twice and left before she could ask questions. It was on the 3rd level, south-facing, with windows that took up most of one wall and a long table that had been built specifically for large-format map work. She could tell by the edge rail, the small brass hooks for holding unrolled sheets, the recessed lighting channels above. The shelves were stocked with drafting supplies that were better than anything the guild had given her in 12 years. There was a theodolite in the corner that she was almost certain had never been used. She stood in the center of the room for a long time. She had not cried in 9 years. She was not going to cry over a map workshop. She cried over the map workshop. She was wiping her face when Tarquin appeared in the doorway. He was quiet. He was always quiet, and he looked at her expression with the same direct attention he brought to everything, making no attempt to pretend he hadn't seen. "Is it wrong?" he said. "The table height, the lighting." "It's not wrong," she said. "It's the opposite of wrong. That's the problem." He crossed the room and stood in front of her. He was still healing. She could see it in the careful way he held his left side, the slight restriction in his movement. She felt the pull of the stitches, the hum she had started thinking of as the thread feeling, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum, because it was too much to hold in her face. "You used your hair," he said, "every strand you needed, without stopping to wonder whether it was worth it. You could have let me die. I wouldn't have known. No one would have blamed you. You're a cartographer, not a surgeon, not a soldier." He paused. "You didn't. So I will spend whatever time I have making sure you have what you deserve." "That's not generosity. It's calibration," she laughed. The sound surprised her. It came out cracked and genuine, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "Calibration," she said. "I'm a military man. I think in terms of measurement." "So do I," she said. "I just never thought anyone would apply it to me." He reached up and put his hand against the side of her face, careful, like she was terrain he was trying to understand. She let him, and through the contact, that warmth again, the thread feeling spreading through her until it settled, until the thing behind her sternum that had been straining for 8 days finally eased. She did not pull away. Ironhold was not easy. Nothing about the city was easy, and nothing about being the war commander's inexplicable, unannounced, structurally unprecedented bond partner was easy either. The court, what existed of it. The council representatives and senior officers and their assembled families watched Veyn with the particular attention of people cataloguing a threat they don't fully understand. A woman named Bressel, sharp-faced and precise, who served as Tarquin's senior intelligence officer, fell into step beside Veyn in the second week, when Veyn was making her way back from the lower city survey she'd started on her own initiative. "You understand what you are," Bressel said. "Not a question." "A cartographer," Veyn said. "Don't." Bressel's voice was without heat. "I've been reading about what Corval found in those stitches. There are records in the Pact archives, old ones from before the Accord, about something called anchor workers, people who could create material bonds, not symbolic ones. Actual connections." She looked at Veyn sideways. "They were disbanded, violently, 300 years ago." Veyn kept walking. "Why?" she said, because the question was simple, and the answer would tell her everything. "Because an anchor worker bonded to the right person is extraordinarily difficult to move against," Bressel said, "and extraordinarily dangerous to move against. They can transmit, through the bond, through the thread, anything they feel. Pain, fear, knowledge. An anchor worker bonded to a military commander in the field would be a catastrophic intelligence liability, or the most powerful asset anyone has ever seen, depending on which side they're on." She paused. "You stitched the war commander of the Ironhold Pact with 27 strands of your own hair. The bonds are holding and growing stronger. There are people in this city connected to the old opposition that fought the anchor workers 300 years ago who will not find that acceptable." Veyn stopped walking. She looked at Bressel. "Who specifically?" she said. Bressel's expression shifted, something almost like approval. "You're sharper than you present. I've been invisible my whole life," Veyn said. "It teaches you to watch." "Commander Shale Vorick," Bressel said quietly. "He has 2 seats on the field council. He's been with the Pact for 30 years. He served under Tarquin's predecessor, and he has never fully transferred his loyalty. And he has been making quiet inquiries about the archive records on anchor workers since the day you arrived." That night, Veyn lay in the rooms she'd been given. 3 of them, which was still bewildering. She had lived in a single room above the Guild's eastern supply depot for 4 years, and stared at the ceiling and catalogued what she knew. She was, apparently, something the world had tried to erase. She had spent 12 years being invisible, being useful, being precisely as much as her guild contract required, and no more. She had eaten after others, slept in whatever space remained, made herself small enough to fit wherever she was needed, and leave no mark when she left. She had told herself it was professional. She had told herself she preferred it. She had told herself the maps were enough. They were not enough. She understood that now, in this room, in this city, with a bond humming quietly in her chest like a second heartbeat, they had never been enough. She had only been convinced they were, because no one had ever offered her anything else. She did not sleep well, but she got up in the morning and went to the workshop and made maps, because that was what she did when she didn't know what else to do, and the work steadied her the way it always had, her hands moving with the precision that had defined her entire life. She was halfway through a detailed survey of the northern approach roads when she heard the footsteps behind her. Not Tarquin, she could tell by the weight, the cadence. She was learning his footsteps the way she learned terrain. By pattern and repetition, she turned. The man who stood in the doorway was broad-shouldered, perhaps 60, with the worn-in look of someone who had spent decades being unquestioned in rooms like this. He wore a Pact Council insignia on his collar. He looked at her with an expression she recognized from a lifetime of being assessed and found wanting. "You're the cartographer," he said. "Yes, Shale Vorick," he said, Field Council. She had known the moment he appeared in the doorway. Not from his face, she hadn't known his face yet, but from the quality of the attention. The kind that wasn't curiosity, the kind that was calculation. "I know who you are," she said. He stepped into the room. He looked at the survey on her table, at the instruments, at the shelves of materials. He looked at her hair, shorter now on one side where she'd cut the strands, grown into an uneven line she hadn't bothered to correct. "You understand," he said, "that what you've created is unprecedented, so I've been told. And that Tarquin doesn't fully understand what he's carrying, what you've embedded in him." He picked up a measure weight from the table and turned it in his hands. An anchor worker's bond gives her access to everything the bonded person knows, feels, everything he's loyal to. You could extract the Pact's field strategy through him without ever entering a single briefing room. She said nothing. "I'm not accusing you of that intention," Vorik said. "I'm identifying the risk, a risk that the Pact cannot responsibly ignore." He set the weight down. "There is a council vote in 3 days. It would resolve your status, whether you remain, under what conditions, or whether the bond is dissolved." "The bond can't be dissolved," Veyn said. She knew this the way she knew terrain, by direct measurement. "Not easily," Vorik agreed, "but there are methods, old ones. I have access to the archive records, and I am not the only member of the council who believes this situation requires resolution." He left without another word. She stood at her map table and felt the thread feeling in her chest and breathed. She went to find Bressel. She told Tarquin that evening. He was in the lower hall going over supply chain assessments when she arrived, and he looked at her face when she walked in and sent everyone else out of the room without being asked, which was either very perceptive or very alarming. Both, probably. She told him about Vorik, about the council vote, about the archive records and the methods for dissolution. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she could feel, through the bond, through all 27 threads, the quality of his stillness. Not calm, contained. "He won't succeed," Tarquin said. "I know, but I need you to hear something first." She put her hands flat on the table between them and looked at him directly. "I don't know what I am. I didn't know anchor workers existed until 4 days ago. I don't know what the bond gives you access to, or what it gives me. I don't know if it's safe. I don't know if—" "Veyn, I'm cataloguing uncertainties. Let me finish." A pause. Then, quietly, "Go ahead. I don't know if you would have chosen this if you'd understood what it was. I didn't choose it either. And I think you need to decide, with full information, whether you want to fight for something neither of us chose, or whether it would be more reasonable to." "Veyn." His voice was different now, stripped of the command register, of the controlled authority she had come to think of as his natural timber. Something underneath it, something she didn't have a name for yet. "I was bleeding out on a floor. You didn't know me. You had nothing to gain from it, and you used the only thing you had." He paused. "That wasn't nothing. That was everything. And I knew it in the moment you started, and I've known it in every moment since." She looked at the table, at her hands on the wood. "That's not a reason to fight a council vote," she said quietly. "You are the reason to fight the council vote," he said. "I don't need another one." 3 days later, Vorik made his motion. The vote was close. Veyn stood in the gallery above the field council chamber and watched from the position she had occupied her entire life. Above, outside, observing, and counted the hands and calculated the margins and understood, before the final tally, that it was going to be 4-4. Tarquin was the deciding vote. She had not known that. He had not told her. He voted to stay. After the chamber cleared, when it was only him and Bressel and Veyn in the gallery hallway, Bressel looked at Tarquin and said, very carefully, "You understand this isn't finished. Vorik has outside connections. He'll move through other channels." "I know," Tarquin said. He looked at Veyn. "He'll move against you specifically. If he can remove you, the bond dissolves." "I know," Veyn said. "Then don't go anywhere alone. I've been going places alone my entire life." "Not anymore," she wanted to argue. The independence that had kept her alive and functional through 12 years of guild contract work rose up in her like a physical reflex. She did not need protection. She had never needed protection. She had needed, at various points, better light to work by, a warmer coat, and approximately 3,000 more maps, but she had managed without all of those, and she could manage without this. And she had spent 12 years managing. She looked at Tarquin, and he looked at her, and through the bond between them all 27 threads held steady. And she understood, with the same accuracy she brought to survey measurements, that managing was not the same as living. "Fine," she said, "but I have a survey to finish. Then we'll finish it together." She almost smiled. "You don't know how to use a theodolite. Show me." So she showed him. It was 3 weeks before Vorik moved, and he did it on a market morning when the lower city was loud enough to cover movement, and Veyn had, against her own better judgment, slipped out alone to verify an elevation measurement she'd been uncertain about since the first week. She was on the 3rd tier of the carved stairways when the dart hit the side of her neck. She did not lose consciousness immediately. The compound, whatever it was, worked slowly, pulling her senses down by degrees, and she had just enough time to understand what was happening and to press her palm flat against the stone wall and send everything she had down the bond. Not a signal, not a word. Everything, every piece of what she was, the cartographer, the invisible woman, the anchor worker, the person who had spent 12 years managing and 3 weeks learning what it felt like to stop. She pushed it all toward him with a force that had nothing to do with muscle or will, and the bond carried it the way thread carries tension, instantly, without distance. She heard him before she saw anything. Not footsteps, not his voice. His heartbeat through the bond, accelerating from the measured rhythm she had come to know to something she had no point of reference for, something that didn't have a name in the maps she had made of him. She woke in a storage room on the lower tier, wrists bound with rope, the compound fading badly enough that she could move her fingers. There were 2 men with her she didn't recognize. Vorik stood near the door. "This is a precaution," he said, "not a punishment. You have to understand that." She pulled at the rope. It was not silver. She was not a wolf. She had no particular vulnerability. It was just rope, and her wrists were small, and she was a woman who had spent 12 years climbing terrain that required significant hand strength, and she had measured more difficult problems than this. "What I understand," she said, "is that you're afraid." Vorik's expression did not change. "I am appropriately cautious about, you're afraid," she said again, "the same way the people 300 years ago were afraid. Something exists that you can't fully control or predict, and your solution is to remove it." She looked up at him. "That's not strategy. That's fear wearing strategy's coat." Something moved behind his eyes. She heard the wall crack. It was not figurative. The storage room shared a wall with the main staircase shaft, and the crack ran from floor to ceiling in less than a second, and then the wall came apart at the join point, and Tarquin came through it. Not around it, through it. His shoulder had hit the junction point at full force, and the old stone had given, and he stood in the gap with dust still falling around him, and looked at Vorik with an expression that Veyn understood, across the room through the bond, was not anger. It was past anger. Anger has heat. This had the quality of a conclusion. "Untie her," he said. The 2 men by the wall moved immediately. She felt the rope go slack. Tarquin crossed to her. He looked at her face, her wrists, the mark on her neck where the dart had hit. His hands came up and held her face the way you hold something you came very close to losing. "I'm all right," she said. "You sent me everything," he said. His voice was rough. "I felt all of it. I know. I meant to." Vorik had not moved. He stood near the door with the stillness of a man who had run his calculations and found the outcome he hadn't planned for. Tarquin turned to look at him, and the quality of his attention made every person in the room very still. "You have one opportunity," Tarquin said. "Explain to me why I should not end this conversation here." Vorik met his eyes. "Because I acted to protect the pact, not to betray it. You acted to protect what you understood. That is different, perhaps." Vorik paused. "But I am not wrong that she is a risk you have not fully calculated." Tarquin was quiet then. "You're right. I haven't fully calculated it." He looked at Veyn. "I don't intend to." "Some measurements," he said, and she heard in it the specific echo of her own language, the vocabulary she'd spent weeks sharing with him. "You take, and then you stop trying to qualify." Vorik left the Pact Council 3 days later, quietly, with no formal charges filed and no public statement. Tarquin did not explain the decision to the broader council. He did not need to. 27 threads was apparently enough to change the strategic calculus of the Iron-Hold Pact without anyone requiring an announcement. Veyn finished her survey of the northern approach roads. Then she started on the interior mountain passes, which had not been accurately mapped in 60 years, and which she found, to her private delight, to be significantly more complex than the Guild's records suggested. She was 3 weeks into the mountain survey when Tarquin found her in the workshop at dusk, bent over the full-format table with 2 candles burning at the corners and her theodolite notes spread across the surface. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She had learned the sound of him, the specific rhythm of his breathing, the way his heartbeat came through the bond like a tide she'd calibrated herself to. She always knew when he was there. "What are you working on?" he said. "The Eastern Ridge Passage. The Guild's old survey has the elevation wrong by 40 meters. It changes everything about the approach from the north. Anyone coming through that passage in winter would find themselves on entirely different terrain than the maps suggest." She smoothed the edge of the sheet. "I don't know how no one caught this, because no one was looking hard enough." She glanced back at him. He had crossed the room and was standing behind her now, looking over her shoulder at the survey, and she was used to this, the way he learned things by standing close, by asking questions that sounded simple and weren't. She had been teaching him the language of maps for weeks, and she found, to her ongoing surprise, that he was good at it. He thought in terms of topography already, he just hadn't had the vocabulary. "Come look," she said. He came around the table and stood beside her, and she walked him through the ridge survey. The points of the old measurements diverged from her new ones. The implications for the approach routes and the winter supply lines, and the 3 garrison positions that were currently cited based on wrong information. Somewhere in the middle of the explanation, she became aware that his attention had shifted, not to the map, to her. "Veyn," he said. "The ridge discrepancy also affects the vine." He put his hand over hers on the table, and through the contact the bond settled into that particular frequency it had when they were both still, both present, both not pretending to be occupied with anything else. "I need to tell you something. Tell me. I have been avoiding it for 3 weeks because you have been busy and because it seemed large. For a workshop, possibly for any room." She turned to look at him. His silver eyes were steady, holding that quality she had mapped carefully, the look of a man who had decided something and was being honest about the weight of it. "I love you," he said simply, without the commander register, without any of the authority that usually shaped his voice. Just the statement, placed on the table between them like a measurement he'd finally committed to paper. "I have been uncertain about the correct term for what I've been experiencing since you threaded a graving needle with your own hair in a collapsing map room, but I have now measured it from sufficient angles that I'm confident in the assessment." She stared at him. "You're confident in the assessment," she repeated. "I have cross-referenced it against available data. The data is consistent." She laughed. It was the same cracked, real laugh she'd produced the first time, the one that surprised her. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and felt the tears that had appeared, apparently without her authorization, on her face. "I love you," she said when she could. "For the record, I have been certain for longer than I'd like to admit, because you sat down on a cold floor and asked me to show you how to read terrain, and then you learned, actually learned, and no one has ever, I have never, been asked to." She stopped. He stepped closer and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face into his chest and breathed. And through the bond all 27 threads went quiet, in the way they went quiet when nothing needed to be said. She made him something. It took her 2 weeks, working in the early mornings before the workshop filled with light. She worked at the small tabletop loom she'd found in the supply room, a thing no bigger than her forearm, and she wove with her hands, and with what she was beginning to understand was the anchor worker's craft, each thread carrying something of the bond, each pass of the shuttle reinforcing what the stitches had begun. It was a field map, woven, not drawn. She had never seen it done, and she invented the technique as she went, her hands moving with the same precision she brought to paper survey work. And the image that emerged from the thread was Ironhold, the mountain city, the tiered levels, the carved stairways, the surrounding terrain with the ridge pass, correct the true elevation recorded in the weave itself. She had embedded a legend in the border, thread weight variations that encoded the measurement system, readable by anyone who knew how to look. And in the center, so small you had to hold it at an angle to see, the 2 points she had placed on every uncertain survey, 2 small open circles, the notation for questions that remained open, things she hadn't finished, things she intended to return to. Side by side, close enough to touch. She brought it to him on a morning when the council had cleared and the hall was quiet, and she held it out without explanation. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "The 2 circles," he said. "Open questions," she said. "Things I haven't finished mapping." "What are they?" She met his eyes. "Everything that comes next." He took the map from her hands with the care of someone who understood what they were holding. And the bond between them, all 27 threads, sang with a frequency she didn't have notation for yet, and she understood she would spend the rest of her life finding the right measurement for it. She was already looking forward to the work.